So in China, for example, God, this is going to happen here, I think, too. Although maybe people will fight it. If a traffic camera catches you jaywalking in China, the digital ID system has you. It has your blood now. It has your genetic code. It has your photograph. It can identify how you walk. So even if you can't see a face, you can be picked up by gait. It will convict you of jaywalking and take money out of your bank account with no intermediating judiciary at all, and show a picture of you to the people in the neighborhood so they know that you have jaywalked, and reduce your social credit score. And if your social credit score falls below a certain level, then you can't buy drinks from a vending machine. You can't play video games. You can't go on a train. You can't get out of your 15-minute city. All that's already in place in China.
Hello, and welcome back to Sinobabble. The clip that you just heard was a man called Jordan Peterson talking about the social credit system in China. Now, if you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, that's weird. But it also doesn't matter, really, for the purposes of this discussion. The main thing that you need to know about him is that he is a very famous public intellectual. And because he is famous, even though his field of expertise is in clinical psychology, with fame, the more interviews you do, the more people start asking you about things outside your domain of expertise that you might be interested in. The problem with that is that there is a risk that when you talk about broader topics that you're not an expert in, you might get things wrong. And in this case, he is wrong. He's quite wrong, actually, but he's not the only one. In fact, the reason that he's probably wrong is because he's probably got a lot of his information about the social credit system from Western news media outlets, who also tend to be wrong about the social credit system. There's all sorts of misinformation flying around out there about social credit system. Some examples include that this is a giant all-seeing centralized system run by the Chinese central government. If you spend too long playing video games or wasting money on frivolous purchases and posting negative things about the party on social media, you will end up on the blacklist. And also that the government will throttle your internet speeds as a punishment for being blacklisted. Some of these are just wrong, and some of these are like kind of wrong, but the way that the story is being told makes it worse, even if it is a little bit true. There's so many reasons why people are spreading this kind of information. You know, there's lack of Chinese language understanding leading to mistranslations, there's general anti-China sentiment, there's racism. They all play a part here, but again, they're not really important for our discussion. I'm not pro-China or social credit system. I'm not anti-China or social credit system. I don't care. What I care about is people getting things wrong. Nothing annoys me more than people just making things up or just like taking things to their hyperbolic extent when there's really no need. People hating China was here before I got here and will be here long after I'm gone. My contribution today is just to try and basically add some objective facts to the discussion. Add some actual information that's not just people making things up, and hopefully like dispel a few of the myths, and also just like add a bit of truth to the conversation as well. Like, let's just be honest, because I feel that if you are going to just have a little bit of knowledge of this, and that little bit of knowledge is all wrong, what you end up with is a message of China is creating a panopticon and they're going to export it to your country and you're all going to be living under this 1984 dystopian system. Whereas in reality, there's probably just no need to panic at all. If you had all the facts to hand, whether you were pro-China or anti-China, you would know the exact level of reaction that you actually needed to have to the system. And I'm here to tell you that not only has China not created a panopticon, they also probably wouldn't be able to do it at this stage. So however you feel about China, whether you love China, whether you hate it, whatever, welcome on in. Let's get factual. So I felt like a good place to start with this discussion would be with a discussion around the actual name social credit system. I feel like one of the reasons that people have a particular view of this system is because there's been kind of a mistranslation, if you will. Social credit system is probably a good translation if you're trying to get something like coherent in English, but it fails to convey the actual meaning and purpose behind what the Chinese government is trying to create. So in Chinese, the social credit system is 社会信用体系. And if we break that down into its component parts, 社会 means society. Yes, it can mean social, but really it's used more in the sense of like society or community. And then 信用 is translated into credit here. But I think potentially a better translation for our understanding would be something like credibility or trustworthiness. And then 体系 is actually system. So a less nice sounding, but probably technically more accurate translation would be something like community credibility system. This translation does a number of things. First of all, it takes the emphasis off the social aspect of the credit system, which is really important because that really emphasizes the difference between what's written about the system in Western media and by Chinese media. I think it also highlights better that what the Chinese government is trying to do is not rank people, but essentially create, yes, eventually a centralized, but kind of like a general list of trustworthy businesses and people in China. So it's not so much like ranking people or scoring them. It's more like a general understanding. Like you can be on two sides of the coin. You can either be trustworthy or you're an untrustworthy person. I think that's more of the essence of what they're trying to create in China. Bear that in mind as we move forward through this discussion. Before we talk about what the social credit system is, as always, I am going to take a lot of your time right now to talk about the historical context, why China might have introduced a community credibility system or social credit system. We'll just call it social credit system for ease, and what the historical precedents for this kind of system might be. So generally speaking, surveillance systems that kind of monitor people's behavior and help enforce laws and customs are not new to China. Many researchers have speculated that the current social credit system might be based on something called the Baojia system, which was first introduced in China by the great reformer Wang Anshi. And it was sort of created as like a method of local self-defense during the Song dynasty. So this is like the late 10th century to the 11th century in China. So in this system, communities were divided into 10 jia, which formed a bao, and then 5 bao formed a da bao. Basically, you had like groups of 50 families who were responsible for the defense of, like, say, the local village or whatever it was. This system was then adapted by later dynasties to become more like legalistic and moralistic. So a good example would be the Ming dynasty, where the Baojia system was conflated with something called the Lijia system. Lijia meaning like village organization. So this combined like local defense with tax collection, other just general administrative responsibilities. When we move into the Qing dynasty, this is when the Baojia Lijia sort of combination reaches its zenith, and they make it into the lowest form of local self-governance, if you will. Both systems encouraged local self-governance and diminished the number of state-appointed officers to each town or village, as these were all employed locally. Essentially, the systems developed into a form of local militia. Overall, the Baojia and Lijia systems intended to facilitate record-keeping of citizens, reporting of crimes and suspicious activity, general control over citizens' daily activities, and any dissidence against the government. The general consensus understood by the government was that local citizens would be more likely to act prudently if made to supply their own police officers and spies, given that anyone could report you even if no government officials were monitoring the towns, than if policing was solely controlled by the government-appointed policemen. So the more developed this system became, the more it became linked to law enforcement and also the idea of community policing, which include people's sort of moralistic behaviors as well as whether what they were doing was legal or illegal. Every inhabitant was required to report any suspicious activity to the heads of each baojia, who were responsible then for reporting these to local government authorities. If any inhabitant of the division failed to report observed crimes, not only their households would be punished, but also the rest of the households in their division. The imperial government also imposed severe punishments on any household or individuals who were not registered, as this would hinder administrative policing. Employing local citizens meant that the imperial government could reach the farthest corners of the empire without having to employ additional government officials. Overall, the system encouraged citizens to spy on each other and also motivated citizens to report their own wrongdoings over the risk of neighbours doing it for them. Therefore, not only would citizens be discouraged from acting unlawfully, but they would also live more relaxed, knowing that if anyone committed a crime, they would be punished accordingly for it. Although, some officials even encouraged good conduct by providing incentives of sorts or rewards for model citizen behaviour. So try and retain particularly that last bit about rewards and also the local aspects of policing as we move forward through our discussion. During the nationalist regime of 1927 to 1949-ish, the 1939 New Country reforms made the Baojia system the lowest level of self-government in the country. The nationalist government tried to kind of rebrand the Baojia system as like a democratic institution because if you remember from our episodes on Republican China and Nationalist China, the government kind of always had this spiel that China would eventually end up democratic, and this was supposed to be part of that system. These reforms were a democratic institution, a bridge between the tutelary period and the achievement of constitutional government because it tutored the people in democratic self-government. But it was in fact a multifunctional political, social and economic unit designed to subject communities to the routine exercise of nationalist power. The Baojia was interpreted as a body of rules to control local communities, a series of roles the public could fulfill, and a storehouse of resources that could be extracted by the nationalist state. Through the Baojia, then, the state could control and monitor its citizens, carry out its policies, and extract needed human and natural resources. So moving on to the Maoist period, I've already talked everybody's ears off about the rural commune system in the countryside. So if you want to hear about that, you can go ahead and listen to the episodes on things like the Great Leap Forward. They're all there in the archives somewhere. If you're an audio-only listener, you have to go to my website to listen to them, but they do exist. In urban settings, it worked slightly differently to how it worked in communes. So in urban areas, people had something called a work unit. And your work unit not only dictated what kind of job you had, it also determined where you lived, who your neighbours were, where your children went to school, what healthcare you could access, and what food you would eat. Generally speaking, everything would happen as part of that unit's community. You know, you would hang out together after work, and because, especially in early sort of communist China, there were no like nightclubs or bars, gambling is illegal. So people would hang out together in their local communities and sort of like sit on their stoops, if you will. In this sense, local communities in urban China naturally evolved to this kind of like neighborhood watch system. It was kind of a passive structure with a more formal structure built on top of it, because there were members of the work units who would be employed specifically to perform surveillance activities on the community. They would also be in charge of sort of enforcing social behaviour of citizens, for example, making sure that homes and streets and things like that were clean. They would help mobilise people for socialist campaigns. And if there were known petty criminals within the community, they were responsible for keeping an eye on them, essentially. This system was apparently so effective that everyday crime in urban areas was apparently reduced effectively to zero. In those days, this miraculous situation existed in many areas and units. There was no need to close the doors at night, no one picked up and pocketed anything lost on the road. The new socialist morality had become common practice in the whole municipality. Of course, this had its negative side to it too. This constant keeping an eye on your neighbours during a very intense period of socialist campaign meant that other things were normalised. For example, branding people that you didn't like as rightists or counter-revolutionaries. And then people who were in this category, people who were harming socialism, so to speak, were put into the same bracket as other, what they called at the time, 坏分子, which basically means like bad elements. And it could include petty criminals, thieves, swindlers, and even murderers. So if you were somebody who just like said something negative about your boss or the way your job was or the ruling Communist Party, you could be added to this kind of blacklist. You might be purged if you're a member of the party. You might have to give up your job, your children would lose their school place. There are a lot of consequences to this. So it wasn't just like this obviously happy clappy utopia where there was little crime. There was also this kind of looming element to it as well. So the current social credit system that's being built is obviously different to the systems that came before, but we can still see the influence that runs down the line. It's a way more individualistic thing. So before Baojia was obviously linked to people's families, or in the communist period it was linked to their household or their work unit. Now the social credit system is way more individualistic. Everyone is supposed to have their own sort of number, if you will, that could be called at any time. The current system also, to me, reads a little bit more like nudge theory than the previous systems. Whereas in the previous systems, the overt control over people's actions was deliberate. I think now the idea is that there's more of a hands-off approach in terms of what you're being told to do, and instead you're supposed to internalize good actions and moral behaviors and things like that, and you're supposed to actively avoid doing things that might harm your social credit score without necessarily being told that you're not supposed to do that. The state no longer provides everything for the people as it once did, and therefore people are taking more control back over their lives, and this social credit system is supposed to kind of slot in relatively nicely with that reality. So if we bring ourselves back up to today, first of all, in China, there's a lot more people than there used to be, obviously. Society is a lot more fluid. People are moving around more. Those local communities are a lot more fractured. There's less of that neighborhood watch style infrastructure. While it may exist in some places, in some rural or smaller communities, especially in urban areas with people being more transient, you're not going to be able to have just like a generic informal system where people keep an eye on each other. There's less trust in society. And so my basic theory is that the social credit system at some level is trying to get society back to that place where, say, petty crime was very low, people could trust their neighbors, and people could trust businesses because they knew that the state had some sort of oversight over that business, and there is some way that you can measure whether or not you can trust them. But I've been speaking for over 20 minutes now about the historical origins of the social credit system, and I haven't even told you what it is yet. The origin myth of the current social credit system comes from the story of a woman named Huang Wenyun, who, after working for a company where the owner suddenly closed it down and ran off with all the money, and then starting her own business, trying to be trustworthy and produce good goods, only to be sort of pushed out of the market by people producing counterfeit goods based on her product, got upset and felt that there must be some way for businesses in particular to be scored based on how trustworthy they were. So she goes to the US, hoping to learn how to build a more honest business environment in particular. There, she visits 8 cities and interviews many experts and citizens. One concept captures her attention: credit management. Credit management is unfamiliar in China's market economy at this time, and there's little expertise on the topic. She was immediately impressed by what she saw in the US. Upon return, she quickly gets to work. She pens a 10,000-character report petitioning the construction of a credit system and sends it to then-Premier Zhu Rongji. According to her, Zhu was so impressed by the petition that he approved it only 3 days later, in August 1999, and ordered the leadership of the People's Bank of China to immediately take action. As a result, in September of that same year, the Institute of Economics of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, one of China's top governmental research institutes, started a research project on the establishment of a national credit management system. So bear in mind here, as we move forward, that the official story is that the current social credit system is not only initially based on the idea of businesses being more trustworthy, not individuals, but also the inspiration for this system came from the US, not from, communist theory or something like that. In the following years, the need for some sort of regulation that can oversee trustworthiness of businesses in China becomes even more apparent. There's a series of scandals that really damage public trust in large institutions that people have to interact with in their everyday life. In 2004, dozens of infants died of malnourishment after ingesting fake powdered milk. 4 years later, the melamine-tainted milk scandal poisoned nearly 300,000 babies, resulting in an estimated 6 deaths. In 2011, a scandal shocked China when over a dozen passers-by offered no help when they saw a mortally wounded child on the street. In 2018, hundreds of thousands of children received faulty vaccines. These severely affected the trust of citizens in their marketplace and in the government. So eventually the party and the state get their stuff together, and in 2014 they release a blueprint called Planning Outline for the Construction of a Social Credit System 2014 to 2020, which aims to build a social credit system in 6 years. Okay, that's very important. That thing is supposed to be ready by now. The planning outline claimed that many of society's current social problems, from food safety accidents to academic dishonesty, result from the lack of trust and strict regulation of those people who break social trust. To solve these problems, a social credit system is needed that systematically collects data about every person's and every institution's creditworthiness and trustworthiness, and can serve as a basis for a strong reward and punishment system. At its very core, the social credit system is a moralistic endeavour. It's not simply designed to give the state more control and more oversight on people's actions. It's supposed to actually transform thoughts and behaviours of Chinese citizens who then go on to run businesses. From the very beginning, the compliance problem that the social credit system is intended to solve has been framed in moralistic terms. In 2001 already, the People's Daily called for the creation of a corporate and individual credit dossiers, arguing that sincerity, being the root of morality, was indispensable in developing China's market economy. Social credit system policy documents claim its objective is to stimulate sincerity and trustworthiness. The joint punishment system, which is where you are punished across the board in all aspects of your life for a single transgression, explicitly targets acts of untrustworthiness. The social credit system can also be seen as a response to moral crisis in politics. It came to prominence during a time where the political initiative had moved from the centre to the localities, resulting in perceptions of weak central leadership and rampant local corruption. To the extent that the social credit system is also aimed to better check the performance of local administrations, it forms part of efforts started in the second half of the Hu Jintao administration and accelerated under Xi Jinping to centralise power, strengthen discipline, and return the party and its mission civilisatrice back to prominence. So a couple of things there. First of all, if you want to understand a little bit more about what this quote is talking about when they mention the fact that politics was in disarray at this time, especially due to the way that localities were gaining more power. I talk about that a lot in the episode about how Xi Jinping became Emperor of China, so you can go ahead and listen to that one. But also something that they point out here is that the social credit system is, yes, supposed to monitor businesses and people, but it's also supposed to monitor the administration and politics. So here we see the idea of the social credit system spreading beyond its initial sort of realm of just looking at businesses and spreading into all areas of society. 社会, if you will. Upon the release of this document in 2014, the central government began urging particular municipal governments and cities to release versions of what they called like a scoring system. So they're supposed to be kind of like prototypes for what the social credit system could be. This is not the social credit system, okay? The ideas that were introduced by, say, like Alibaba or Wuhan City are not the same thing as the final product of the social credit system. These are very specifically local experiments while they were planning to potentially integrate some of these things into the social credit system if they went well. Now, a lot of these things are initiatives or programs or ideas that have been now picked up on by Western press and used to kind of describe the social credit system as a whole. The example that I mentioned at the beginning of the video about crossing the street is a very good example of that. That was only introduced in one place and is not as described, which we will get into later. So some examples of the ways that local municipalities introduced their own little mini social credit systems. Some government agencies regularly publicised information of people on the discredit judgment debtor list on government websites and limited their access to things such as flight tickets. Some cities publish their own municipal score system, which evaluates residents' trustworthiness, including data such as attitudes towards parents, and gives people with a high score rewards like public transportation discounts. Many mobile apps launched their score system and extended these scores' use into everyday life, such as on the dating market and foreign visa applications. Scholars and media in both China and the West commonly see these diverse practices as different aspects of one unified system. While the Chinese media respond predominantly with praise without critical inquiry, Western media and scholars often depict the Chinese social credit system as a centralized surveillance tool of government control that collects people's biodata, online speech, and social networking. They view it as a crucial part of the Chinese technoscience dystopia that connects commercial systems with governmental datasets and that makes automatic detection and punishment possible. However, a closer look at the Chinese social credit system would debunk these visions as misconceived and exaggerated. The planning outline did not propose a unified and ubiquitous social credit system that controls everything, but rather various social credit systems in different social localities. In practice, as many scholars' recent works have shown, different social credit systems experiments have been conducted and have resulted in a very messy and complicated reality. This reality does include surveillance. It does include the integration of AI tools, like tools that can measure your gait, the collection of biodata and things like that. And it does include close monitoring of your behaviors, sometimes by local busybodies who have nothing better to do with their time. But it's not an integrated system. It's not a social credit system. It's not even understood by Chinese people to be like a whole system, right? It's like lots of different fragmented bits. And because of that, it is a bit of a mess at the moment. It's still a mess. It was a mess in 2014 and it's still a mess till today. The social credit system is not concerned with how many games you play. It does not evaluate everything you write online and cares even less whether you like or share a message praising Xi Jinping online. The idea that a digital and real-time morality score controls Chinese citizens' every step is quickly dispelled by talking to anyone in China. None of this means that surveillance in China is a myth. Quite the contrary. Yet, this surveillance remains very different from indiscriminate AI-driven mass scoring. The real social credit system may actually be quite boring. It's a broad policy umbrella, not an integrated system, to help enforce legally effective obligations such as laws, regulations, and contracts. It does so by creating an information sharing system for administrative and legal information and a complex but fragmented system of blacklists. For example, social credit system enables food safety regulators in Beijing to access information produced by their Shanghai counterparts. If they found a company has violated hygiene regulations in Shanghai, they may want to inspect this company's application for a new permit in Beijing more carefully. The system is profoundly messy, a fact even headlined by China's state-owned media, Xinhua. It features a history of over 20 years of back-and-forth tussle between different government agencies over direction and has repeatedly sparked a significant public backlash. It isn't particularly social, nor really about credit, and it certainly is not a system. There are so many interesting things that we need to kind of like pick out there. Not every single measure implemented by social credit in local areas is popular. They do receive backlash, and it's telling that Chinese people are allowed to have backlash against these things. They're not supposed to just like take these things and accept it. This would be the democracy with Chinese characteristics that the government is always talking about in China. People do have agency and they are allowed to have opinions about this. And as always, I feel like the thing that I'm talking about is always so much more boring than how it seems on paper or how it might have been presented by other outlets. The social credit system in reality is like data collection, basically. Like, it's not any more or less complex than systems that we already have in the West, which is something that I'll get onto in a little bit. Modern credit systems collect and aggregate information on loans, mortgages, and consumer credits from different sources. They convert this information into an overview, sometimes with an evaluation, that informs the lender about potential risks. They can offer sizable loans at lower interest rates for people who have a stable income and always pay credit card bills on time, but will probably refuse credit loans to those with bad credit records. One of the most well-known examples is the FICO score, which analyzes all loans someone has taken out, their payment history, and whether these bills have been paid on time. It transforms that into a 3-digit score that other financial service providers and other relevant parties can request. The FICO credit rating was only one of the many sources of inspiration for the social credit system. Airlines also have blacklists. For example, airlines may not want someone on their plane again if they have previously harassed flight attendants or posed a danger to flight safety. So it's like, of course, credit scores already exist, and of course we have them too. If you've ever tried to take out, say, a loan for a mortgage or something like that, you know very well that credit scores are a real thing and can affect how much you can borrow and things like that. Also, some of the things that you can be blacklisted for are actual criminal activities. And while they may not prevent you from, say, buying a train ticket, in the UK, they can do things like make it more difficult for you to get particular types of jobs. So between 2018 and 2019, there are 62 of these cities that get to test out different things, social credit score related, on their citizenry. Rongcheng, for instance, developed an integrity rating system for taxi drivers. Huizhou, another demonstration city, created a QR code system that allowed citizens and market supervisors to trace products such as oil and grain throughout production, logistics, and distribution. The operational mechanisms vary significantly from region to region. For instance, for violations detected during official inspections, companies get docked points comparable to how one can lose points on a driver's license that last a given period, typically 1 to 3 years. Demonstration city Wuhan, on the contrary, uses a point scale of 0 to 100 with a baseline of 100, the maximum possible. The basic mechanisms are similar, yet Wuhan does not deduct points for official warnings. It also does not differentiate between levels of severity and offers only one category of penalties for all types of untrustworthiness. The consequences are fundamental inoperability between the two systems. What can lead to a lower classification in one city is essentially fine in another. We get another step forward in 2022 when the government releases something called the Social Credit Law, which is a draft that's formulated so as to improve the social credit system, innovate mechanisms for societal governance, optimize the business environment, standardize order in the socialist market economy, raise the entire society's awareness of creditworthiness, and advocate the core socialist values, and complete a credit reporting system that covers the entire society. However, this law doesn't really do anything. It doesn't set out anything more in stone, except for kind of defining the parties who would be beholden to the law and under what circumstances. So, for example, for local governments, the idea is that you don't default on loans. You try and keep up to date with government projects and things like that, and you don't screw over the local people. For businesses and companies, you're not supposed to abuse your advantageous market position, breach contracts, be transparent about the quality of your products, and be aware of financial fraud and malicious tax evasions and things like that. For individuals, you shouldn't violate public security, road traffic safety, immigration rules, border crossings, and internet security. You shouldn't commit fraud or plagiarism or stealing or forgery, trademark squatting, and irregular patent applications. But generally speaking, there isn't anything here that's pushing the social credit system forward into being a more formalized, overarching system. And at this point, you're probably thinking wow, she is so naive. She is so naive to believe that the Chinese government isn't just sneaking all of this in past our noses and using these vague, broad laws to make it seem way more innocent than it actually is. But what if I told you that this could not be true? Because if the Chinese government had built something so impressive that it could actively, constantly, consistently monitor all of the behaviors, thoughts, actions, and tweets of its citizenry at all times, they would be talking about this constantly. They would never shut up about this. And I know this because they talk about the social credit system all the time. They talk about it on government websites, they talk about it in newspapers, they talk about it on social media, they talk about it in blog posts. They are always talking about local initiatives, the great strides taken, the improvements that are being made to the system, new plans that they're coming up with to make it even better and brighter. They are always talking about this thing. They even make reports about it, right? In 2018, they released this report by the National Public Credit Information Center. This report was picked up by Western media, and by Western media I mean like one person translated it for one newspaper, and then every other newspaper just took their article basically word for word and just like put it across all of their websites. But this report was really interesting because it was the first time that the numbers of people who'd been blacklisted and the types of punishments they had received had been fully publicized. There's a particular part that's pulled out by every single one of these Western news reports, so I'm just going to pick it out for you right now. Chinese courts banned would-be travellers from buying flights 17.5 million times by the end of 2018. Citizens placed on blacklists for social credit offences were prevented from buying train tickets 5.5 million times. China's Supreme Court said that in 2017 that 6.15 million citizens had been barred from taking flights because of social credit offences. Now, I read this and I was immediately skeptical because, like I said, they all seem to have copied and pasted from each other, and Chinese literacy is a problem in Western media. And also, I just knew that this report was going to be way longer than they were making it seem. The Chinese government does not release a report that is less than like 200 pages long. So I decided to go and look at it myself. And this was a very eye-opening process because when I compared the actual report to what Western outlets had decided to pick out, I noticed that certain things were left out. So these things include what kind of offences people had committed to end up on this blacklist, whether or not people had been removed from the blacklist for particular reasons, and also case studies, detailed case studies of what certain companies had done and why that justified them ending up as an untrustworthy business. And believe it or not, a lot of these people were not put on the blacklist just for crossing the road incorrectly. So let's take a look at some of the other figures that were in this report. In 2018, there were 2.6 million new dishonest debtors. 472 companies were involved in cases with an amount more than 100 million yuan, of which 20 were involved in cases with the amount of 500 million yuan or more. 957,900 new enterprise licenses were revoked. 8,836 new parties were involved in major tax law. So this bit I wanted to pull out because a lot of the time when I was reading this report, a lot of the charges, either their actions as part of an entity or it applied to the entity itself. So either the individuals running the company were put on the blacklist or the company was put on the blacklist. And one company or one individual could receive more than one penalty point against them. So some companies had like hundreds, even thousands of things that they had done wrong that contributed to their points, which are all added to the social credit system. So not every single black check in the social credit system is against an individual. Sometimes it's one individual who's got hundreds of things that they've done wrong, usually illegal criminal things like tax fraud and like killing babies with the bad milk formula. The departments that identify the specific serious dishonesty blacklists that restrict boarding trains and civil aircraft include the Civil Aviation Administration of China, China Railway Corporation, the China Securities Regulatory Commission, and the State Administration of Taxation. In terms of reasons for inclusion, nearly 50% of the parties were included in the blacklists for carrying or checking dangerous goods, prohibited goods, or controlled items, stipulated by national laws and regulations. 16% of the parties were included on the blacklist for using forged, altered, or impersonated identity documents of others for boarding. Another thing that these articles tend to fail to mention is that many dishonest entities have left the blacklist by actively fulfilling relevant obligations, correcting dishonest behaviours, and eliminating adverse effects. In 2018, a total of 2.17 million entities were taken off the blacklist, and a total of 3.51 million dishonest persons have fulfilled their legal obligations due to credit punishment. In addition, in 2018, the relevant certification of departments removed 92 records of penalties restricting train and civil aircraft travel involving 92 parties. In terms of the reasons for removal, the main reason was the relevant ticket fees were paid, the records were automatically removed, accounting for around a third of the total, followed by automatic removal due to expiration of penalties and fulfillment of obligations. So, not only do these articles completely gloss over the fact that it is possible to repair your credit score just by undoing the bad things that you've done. They also fail to point out, again, public agency and public involvement in enforcing the social credit system. This is particularly important in cases where there is one company that has screwed over multiple people, and then the people bring what the equivalent of like a class action lawsuit is against this entity via the social credit system. Wuhan City has sorted out and summarized more than 1,000 complaints from the public involving black intermediaries and found that 760 of these complaints were directed at 2 real estate agencies, Anyi Home and Hongrude. For example, one landlord found that his house was converted into a capsule room for rent by Hongrude without authorization. He wanted to terminate the contract, but was asked by the company to pay a penalty of almost 10,000 yuan. When the landlord came to argue, Hongrude summoned 7 or 8 tattooed and ferocious men outside the office door to intimidate him. The landlord was forced to pay a £30,000 penalty before getting his house back. There was also a female college student who rented a house through Anyi Home, but could not continue to rent due to a dispute between the intermediary and the landlord. Subsequently, the intermediary used illegal means such as power outages, water outages, and throwing garbage into the house to force her to move out before the lease expired, and forcibly collected liquidated damages and refused to return the deposit. Due to financial difficulties, the student tried to jump off the building, but was forced to stop by the police. On the 15th of August 2018, the People's Court of Wuchang, Wuhan City, pronounced the first instance verdict on the case. According to the trial, the defendants Ren Hongzhuo and Ren Lihong opened 2 real estate agencies, Anyi Zhizha and Hongrude, and used evidence and other means to extort landlords and tenants. They made illegal profits of more than 10 million yuan in the past 3 years, and there were hundreds of victims. The defendants, Ren Hongzhuo, was sentenced to 19 years in prison for 7 crimes, including organizing and leading a mafia-like organization and extortion, and the defendant, Ren Lihong, was sentenced to 13 years and 6 months in prison. So these people and their companies were also added to the blacklist carried out by the social credit system of Wuhan, but they're actual criminals. Like, the list doesn't just cover, people, again, for jaywalking. This example keeps coming up because of that video, but it's not for things like tweeting that you don't like Xi Jinping online, right? It's also crime, because what they want people to know is that when these people do finish their prison sentence, come out and then try and start a new business, actually no, you cannot do that, because you're on this blacklist and we already know that you can't be trusted, right? You can't just hide in the anonymity of being a free person. You have this permanent black mark against your name because you committed an actual crime. This isn't to say that the system is perfect by any means. And of course, there are still times where it can go hugely, hugely wrong. Imagine someone on this blacklist lives far to the east of the country and receives a message from their hometown in the far west country that a family member is in critical condition in the hospital. Without access to high-speed rail or flights, this journey may take over 48 hours. Will they be able to make it back in time? Technically, it's possible to apply to the courts for exceptions for essential travel, and there is evidence that exceptions have been granted for this before. Yet, whether courts will grant it this time is the question. Since courts have complete discretion over what's considered essential, their political and institutional interests may influence whether they do so. In this way, the judgment defaulter blacklist can have a severe adverse impact on the rights of citizens. Similarly, although the restrictions on private schools should theoretically not affect a child's right to education, there are very reasonable scenarios where such rules undermine such rights in practice. In one real-life case, a private school kicked one kid out because their mother had outstanding debts. The issue: the parents were divorced, and the mother didn't have custody of the child. The court later corrected this specific case, but it shows that the balance between protecting children's rights to development and enforcement remains skewed. Those defaulting on petty loans typically receive the same penalties as those owning millions. An example occurred in 2019 when the Wuhan Intermediate People's Court ordered the blacklisting of 2 individual companies that had defaulted on only 600 renminbi, which is the equivalent to 60 quid. its legal representatives were put on the judgment defaulter blacklist and restricted from leaving the country, an additional penalty that courts can impose. These penalties were as severe as those handed to a person who owed over 2 million renminbi. So there's a lot of room for error, essentially, in a fragmented system. And even when it's not necessarily an error per se, there are situations where, again, the idea of somebody's morality being able to be dictated by the state gets a bit cloudy. Sesame Credit's pilot program, for example, will judge you based on the products you buy with Alipay, which is Alibaba's digital payment system. Buying diapers would indicate that you're a parent, and they are more likely to have a sense of responsibility. And a person who plays video games for 10 hours a day would be considered an idle person, according to Li Yingyun, Sesame Technologies director. Your social network will also have an impact. If you have close friends with a low Sesame score, they will drag down your score. With a high Sesame score, you can rent a car without deposit, check in and out of hotels faster, use VIP check-in at Beijing Airport, and get a credit loan for shopping on Alibaba's website. You can also get a visa to Singapore without excessive documents, get fast-tracked application to Pan-European Shenzhen visa, in addition to leaving a hospital without standing in line to pay cash, and instead pay later with Alipay. So compared to the kind of municipal and local city examples that we had, this Alipay system is probably the most dystopian version that I've seen, and is probably also what a lot of news media outlets are picking up on when they discuss this system. And this is also probably what has led the government to start cracking down on these local experiments and sort of curtailing them, like bringing them back in. Like, we're not doing that anymore. That was an experiment. The time is over. But even though the government is now asking all these companies and local municipalities to bring their experiments to an end, this doesn't mean that they're necessarily smoothly transitioning into a centralized system. Quite the contrary. If you remember, I said that the social credit system was supposed to be finished by 2020. Here we are in 2024, and there is no social credit system really in sight. This is actually outlined by the state administration themselves in a recently released notice on the action plan for building a social credit system, which was released by the National Development and Reform Commission, which is in charge of the social credit system. Not only do they outline in this document that no, we don't have a social credit system yet, they also outline all the current problems that stand in the way of creating this system and all the parts of the program that are like lagging behind. They still need to promote the solution of the problem of duplicate codes, multiple codes, and other erroneous codes for individuals and businesses. They need to strengthen the function of the National Credit Information Sharing Platform as the general hub for credit information collecting and sharing, and forming a credit information network covering all credit subjects. In principle, only one provincial platform should be retained in a province, and no more than one platform will be set up at the municipal and county levels. The integrated platform should have a unique name and a unique operating body. They still need to promote the establishment of joint laboratories for credit information collection and processing between financing and credit service platforms and financial institutions. And localities are being encouraged to explore the expansion of credit incentive scenarios based on credit scores and promote the implementation of the Credit Plus project in key areas such as medical care, childcare, nursing care, housekeeping, tourism, shopping, and travel. So not only is there no centralized system, but even though the government has sort of called for the end of local experiments, they're still expecting localities to be the ones to carry out whatever system is finally created, even though the system doesn't actually exist yet. Like, it's still, you can tell that it's still a big mess because the wording that they're using is so vague and broad. And if it was being successful, they'd be very specific about what was successful. But this doesn't mean that the social credit system should be overlooked. Even the idea of it being a way to better monitor, surveil, and nudge citizen behavior is something that's already being touted as a model that other countries can adopt. At the end of the day, it's still like a nanny state measure at the very least. And if we get to the other extreme, it's going to be like this completely totalitarian, overbearing system, right? If we go back to the example that Jordan Peterson gave of the program being able to sort of measure how you walk and then like punishing you for that and putting your picture up on a billboard, yes, that could be annoying, but there are way more dystopian examples that you could have used. For example, if you're at a protest and the security camera can just like immediately find out who you are and put you on a blacklist because of that, that's way more dangerous. But the reason that he hasn't used it as an example is because it hasn't happened yet and it might not ever happen. Instead of focusing on these sort of like make-believe situations and whether or not they may come into practice, I think there are other sort of pernicious aspects of the social credit system that people don't talk about that we should talk about, because, you know, people only focusing on the punishments distorts the other side of the coin, which is the kind of like perverse incentives side of the social credit system, which in my opinion is actually worse than the punishment side. So stick with me here. The social credit system is both a punishment and reward system, right? So you get punished for doing things that are considered either illegal or morally bad, and then you get rewarded for doing things that are good. And there are loads and loads of examples of this. If you look at different stories, there are examples of people helping their neighbors out during a flood, for example, or giving blood or donating to charity, or, you know, there's one that went around at the very beginning of the social credit system where this cleaner returned a wallet. He didn't take any money out of the wallet, and then he got like a banner in his name and like a plaque to hang up in his house, or just something really stupid. So it all seems really like benign and whatever on the surface. And so the idea behind it is that people are trying to actively improve their behavior. Even if you've done something wrong, you can actually undo those wrongs by improving your behavior, or like undoing whatever you've done in the past. So if you haven't paid a bill, you can pay the bill. But then also, if in general you just want to bump up your score, maybe you can donate to charity. Maybe you can donate your time and do charitable acts and do volunteering. Maybe you can donate your blood. All of these sorts of things are examples of things that have been used in certain scenarios to help improve people's social credit scores, either to get them out of a rut or just to improve it generally. Now, as a toddler mum, my instinct when I see something like this is like, oh no, this is a terrible idea, because generally speaking, you shouldn't be raising people with the expectation that every good deed that they do will be rewarded either with an item or praise because of that deed. People should be raised with the idea that you should just be a good person because that's better for society, right? There shouldn't be a reward attached to it. We're not Pavlov's dog. And for me, this is the major flaw of the social credit system. It's not only creating an entire society that will believe that they're entitled to be rewarded because they're, you know, morally better or whatever. It's also running the risk of creating entirely new classes and stratifications within society. For example, if we're, say, on a fictional playground, it's very likely that just like in the Maoist days of, you know, belonging to a red or black family, children could rate their friendships and exclude certain children based on whether or not their parents are on the good list or the naughty list, right? That's something that children will pick up on because kids are mean. And if that's ingrained at a young age, that your social credit score is basically who you are, right? Because if it's trustworthiness, then that's like an intrinsic part of your personhood, right? And if it's saying that your trustworthiness is good, then you don't really have to prove that you're a good person because you've got a piece of paper that proves it for you. And if you're on the blacklist, there's nothing that you can do to redeem yourself in the eyes of others because, well, this is a formalized system and it says that you're bad. So why should we take your word for it that you're good when there's literally a list that we can refer to that proves that you're not? And I don't think it's outside the realms of possibility that people will be able to use their wealth and resources to bump up their scores generally, so they're never really close to dropping below the line, even if they do something bad. Like, if you do get some minus points, say for speeding, if you've already been donating to charity or volunteering your time, then your score is already too much above the threshold for you to drop below the blacklist red line, right? So it will create a system where people who aren't actually good can essentially pay their way to the top, because people who can afford to donate money or donate time are going to be white collar workers plus, you know, like business owners, people who can afford for their children to do it as well. Migrant workers, gig workers, not so much. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, and so they're always the ones who are going to be on this line, right? They're the ones who are going to have to prove themselves by their daily actions, and any wrong step, any missed opportunity for self-censorship might push them below and might ruin their entire lives, essentially. I think the nudge theory, positive incentive side of the social credit system is worth way more scrutiny than the punishment side. We already have punishments. Okay, we have them in the West as well. If you've got a bad credit score, we already have cases where people are cancelled, right? We have cancellations. That is literally the same thing as your morality being scrutinized by a large part of the public, and then you being, say, deplatformed from whatever platform you're using. There are people who've been removed from Patreon. There are people who have been not allowed to speak at universities. We already have these systems ingrained in our mentality. We don't need an external force to do it for us, because the society itself is already like trained as a body to do this. And this is basically what they're trying to create in China. I'm telling you, they were inspired by us, not the other way around. I think this idea of like the positive side of things being more impactful is also reflected in some studies that people have done. So for example, there is this cross-regional survey of 1,600 respondents that showed that a surprisingly high share of respondents report having changed their behavior at least once, and those changes are concentrated in a few categories. Reported behavioral changes often seem to be driven by motivations to improve personal scores. 91% of respondents changed their behavior at least once to positively influence their score. 85% reported changing their behavior to avoid penalties. The Directional Behavior Change Index reinforces the view that a change in behavior is driven by positive inducements. The most common changes made to influence scores positively is using mobile payment apps more than often, adjusting shopping behavior, and donating money. The most common reported behaviors aimed at avoiding negative scores is following traffic regulations, adjusting shopping behavior, and reducing the amount of time spent playing online games. In total, 18% of respondents reported sharing different content online, and 17% reported having unfriended a friend on social media because of their low score. Social credit scores seem to influence interpersonal relations. When asked whether one would change their opinion if a friend had a sudden drop in their credit score, 38% of respondents stated that they would think differently about their friend, while 38% also stated that they would not think differently, while 25% were undecided. On this note, and as we're sort of wrapping up this discussion, I think we should talk about what we know so far about the reception of the social credit system in China, which essentially is not a lot. When you talk to people on a daily basis, if they're not in one of these trial cities, they don't really know that much about it. And even if they are, some people still didn't know that much about it. But I don't think it should be over or understated how much the average Chinese citizen would probably welcome something like this. Not because it's like propaganda and they want to fall in line with the state, otherwise they're afraid of being blacklisted. But I think generally in China, like especially the conversations that I've had with Chinese friends in the past, Chinese people as well are kind of sick of certain behaviors of certain people, you know, like spitting on public transport, bringing a whole bag of live chickens onto a bus, people being just rude for no reason. There are lots of things in China that I think average citizens would want to change about how people behave towards each other. The lack of kinship, the lack of trust, you know, like if someone's hit by a car and nobody goes to help them, is that really the kind of society that you want to live in? And this is reflected in a study that a woman called Jenny Acosta carried out, where she writes about how actually when you survey people, the social credit system writ large has a fairly high rate of approval among people. And in fact, the more people know about the social credit system, the more likely they are to think of it as a way that you can promote a moral and honest society and economy. More highly educated respondents care more about data privacy protection. Given these findings, one would expect that older, highly educated respondents would be more skeptical of the social credit system. Younger, wealthier, and better educated urban elites in provinces with high levels of development have strong preferences for democratic institutions and liberal views. Again, one might expect that this correlates with liberal views in China would also predict a more skeptical appraisal of the social credit system. However, respondents report a high degree of approval of the social credit system, with 80% of respondents either somewhat approving or strongly approving of the social credit system. Only 19% of respondents perceive the social credit system in value-neutral terms, neither approving nor disapproving, while just 1% reported either strong or somewhat disapproval. The 51 to 65 age group shows the strongest approval levels, with 56% of respondents strongly approving a social credit system. Social credit system approval is also higher among residents with a higher income. Approval is highest in the group of respondents with the highest education and lowest in the group with low education. Approval levels are higher in cities than in rural areas, 82 versus 68%. And while we find that younger respondents are indeed less approving of the social credit system, somewhat surprisingly, the better educated and wealthier respondents are more approving of social credit system. The doubters, i.e. 20% of respondents who either strongly or somewhat disapprove or neither approve nor disapprove, can be summarized as follows. They are younger, have very low income, are slightly more likely to be female, have less education, and are more likely to live in rural areas. I think from a sociological standpoint, it's quite interesting that the urban-rural divide, which is very strong in China, rears its head again when it comes to the social credit system. And this is definitely something that the CCP is going to have to be aware of moving forward. Most of the campaigns for the social credit system are based in urban areas. Most of the benefits that you can get out of it are also things that are only accessible to people who live in urban areas. So I think the thing that the CCP is going to have to work on most actually is promoting the value of the social credit system, first of all, to people who might not be able to understand it in complex terms, and also to people who don't necessarily live in areas where there's any real benefit to it. Like if I don't live near a convenience store, why would I care that I can get a discount at this convenience store? To kind of wrap everything up, I want to go back to the very first example that I gave, which was where Jordan Peterson was talking about the case of the government using a measurement of your gait to know that it's you that's jaywalking, putting you on this blacklist and putting your billboard picture up everywhere. So first of all, this is a thing that is true. A little bit. It's true a little bit. So there was a program in, I think, Hangzhou, where if you illegally crossed the road 5 times, then you would be added to the blacklist. I have a few problems with this example. First of all, jaywalking is a punishable offence in dozens of countries and in dozens of provinces in those countries, including Canada, where Jordan Peterson is actually from. And trust me, the fine that you pay is much higher than the fine that you would pay in China, which is around the equivalent of about £5. Not only do other countries have these rules, sometimes these rules are enforced so heavily that people who are not even citizens of that country have been jailed for offending the local citizenry for not obeying their jaywalking rules. And I just want to give this example of a British man in America because it just made me laugh so much. It's a cautionary tale for any traveller. Distinguished historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto tried to cross the road while in Atlanta for the conference of the American Historical Association, only to find himself in handcuffs and surrounded by armed police. I come from a country where you can cross the road where you like. It hadn't occurred to me that I wasn't allowed to cross the road between the 2 main conference venues. The bespectacled professor said he didn't realise the rather intrusive young man shouting that he shouldn't cross there was a policeman. I thanked him for his advice and went on. The officer asked for identification, the professor asked for his, after which Officer Leon Patcher told him that he was under arrest and, the professor came, kicked his legs from under him, pinned him to the ground and confiscated his box of peppermints. And take this as an overview of the system as it really stands, okay? I've tried not to give any colouring to this. I've tried to present both sides, the good, the bad, the morally grey. If you want to go away and use this to promote the social credit system, go ahead. If you want to continue to denigrate it, whatever. I don't care. I just wanted to get the facts across and just basically convey the fact that it's really just not as simple as it appears on the surface. And as always, it's a lot more boring than people are making it seem. So thank you for tuning into this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Just to do a quick shout out to my other avenues of work, I also have a Substack. where I write about more current news topics. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee. I'm gonna start uploading more videos to there from next month onwards. I want to do kind of like a book club sort of thing. I haven't figured it out properly, but one video I will upload there is the Peter Zeihan episode that I did, that a lot of you will have seen before I removed it because the comments were absolutely insane. So if you're a sensible human being, you can go onto the Buy Me a Coffee and watch that again if you want to, or watch it for the first time if you have no idea what I'm talking about. If you're listening through an audio platform, please rate the podcast as good or bad if you don't like it. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe, etc. blah blah blah. Thanks so much for listening, guys, and I hope to see you in the next one.